Aquí está el audio.
Great.
Sí, imagínate.
Well, NAFTA is a national issue right now, but if there's one place where the conversations about NAFTA never actually stopped happening, it's in the border region. And so with everything going on, obviously we decided this was a topic we couldn't miss this year. And so we put together a panel for you that I think you'll find to be excellent. We have a really great group of panelists, and I'll let Paula introduce them in just a second. But let me just say to Paula, who is a longtime collaborator of ours and friend of ours here at the Mexico Institute, worked with her in her capacity at the San Diego Regional Chamber for years. We're just delighted to have you as the president, the chair of the Border Trade Alliance now, and to partner with you and the Border Trade Alliance on this event. So thanks so much for the ongoing partnership, Paula. And let me just pass it over to you and let you run the show.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. I am really pleased to be here and appreciate the opportunity to facilitate this panel discussion because of these participants who are very knowledgeable in each of their fields, and certainly as it pertains to NAFTA. I'm going to start with Bernardo Ayala, who is with Union Pacific. He is the vice president of Mexico operations there, and in his position, he's responsible for the strategic and tactical management of Union Pacific's Mexico markets, as well as overseeing the company's cross-border sales and operations. He's also currently a member of the board of directors for the Brownsville and Matamoros Bridge Company. A full bio of each panelist, by the way, is included in the packet in the back, so I'm just going to highlight a couple of things so that we can get to the conversation. Then with us as well is Maria Luisa. Maria Luisa serves as the director for UPS Global Public Affairs. She previously served at USCBP. She was senior advisor to the Commissioner for Trade and Private Sector Engagement and director for the Office of Trade Relations. She held other positions there at CBP, including assistant commissioner for CBP's Office of Public Affairs. Very pleased to have you join us today. And then Jose Martin Garcia, he is the representative for the Mexican Treasury and Tax Administration Service in Washington, D.C. here. He has been leading negotiator and coordinator of the working groups created to develop and implement customs initiatives under U.S. Mexico Customs Bilateral Strategic Plan, was really instrumental in the work and the effort that has led to the unified cargo processing, which is a tremendous asset to the border region and trade facilitation. And then finally, but not least, Jose Antonio. He is has been in the Mexican customs broker industry for quite some time. He's the CEO of Grupo 365 Integral Logistics Solutions. He was previously the president of the National Executive Committee of CAREM, the Mexican Confederation of Associations of Customs Agents. So we're very pleased again. Thank you for joining us. As Chris mentioned, and as you've heard in the last two panel discussions or discussions, the importance of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And this is the 5th annual conference with that title. How do we make the U.S.-Mexico relationship even more competitive? And for the last 5 years, there's been a variety of topics that have been covered, from challenges that we faced and have been facing, like lacking infrastructure, which has led to border wait times, workforce development, dual certification and acknowledgement, the non-physical barriers to trade, which are facilitating customs processing, how to streamline customs processing. Many of those challenges have been addressed. We've gained ground, but many still exist. But recently, a new one was added to our plate, NAFTA, the threat of losing NAFTA. NAFTA, which has been a tool to make our region and our border and the two countries more competitive, addressing, again, building a competitive U.S. Mexico border. It's a tool which in San Diego has created a $2.5 billion integrated supply chain. A tool which we obviously have taken for granted because now it's under threat. In my work at the chamber and with BTA, that wasn't something that we were worried about years ago. It's a new threat which changes things, because when you're making advancements in policy to address existing challenges and a new one is thrown on your lap, it certainly changes the dynamic. So as we've heard earlier today, while we were utilizing this tool to improve our relationship and trade, meanwhile, the opponents of NAFTA for the last 25 years have had a very coordinated and on-point message opposing NAFTA. Meanwhile, we were getting to work. So, as mentioned earlier, we need to do a better job of communicating to the general public, not just those who are involved in trade or U.S.-Mexico relationships, on the benefits of trade and the benefits of NAFTA. Communicating that to the general consumer. We heard that on the Hill in our meetings yesterday, and then we heard that again today. Congressman Will Hurd made that very clear. So we need to tell our story because it is a great story. Spoiler alert, everyone supports NAFTA on this panel. So you will hear pro-NAFTA comments, pro-trade comments. And our story begins with how NAFTA has improved trade, facilitated trade, our economy, how it has impacted supply chains, jobs, new jobs that have been created, new exports, not just imports, foreign direct investment that we've attracted, and our competitiveness. And then overcoming challenges, how to improve NAFTA. How can we improve customs facilitation, building the infrastructure? How can we, and what can an improved NAFTA bring us? And then what are the points of contention? What do we stand to lose? What is on the line if we are not successful and we lose NAFTA, or if it changes dramatically, if it is a bad deal, if it is a bilateral deal? Is that a good thing, a bad thing? So that is the story we're going to tell today in this panel discussion. We will have an opportunity for questions from you throughout, so please get those ready, and we'll work those in to the conversation. It's going to be a very informal conversation and exchange, so feel free, each of you, to jump in at any time as questions are asked, whether by myself or the public. So I'm going to begin again as we tell our story about NAFTA with Bernardo. If you could please tell us how freight railroads drive economic activity across NAFTA partners. How has NAFTA changed the railroad industry?
Sure. So again, thank you for the opportunity. Glad to be here. I don't know if you have a slide I put up there that I brought to the presentation. I don't know if it's there or not, don't matter, but yep. I was going to first share, and I'm not going to talk about the numbers in there, but just it's staggering in terms of what NAFTA means to not only to trade, but to integration of the three countries as a region. So just reflect on some of those numbers. Actually, there's something I love to the, I think it's the lower left to you guys. Talks about truck and rail, and you can see how trade associated to trucking and railroading has grown exponentially in the last few years. So if you ask me about telling our story from a rail perspective, I can't say anything other than it's been growth. If we look at Union Pacific's performance in the late 90s, our volumes back then were, they were not significant, but they were small, and they've more than doubled in the last 10 years with over a 4% CAGR since NAFTA was enacted. Year-over-year growth. Today, our business accounts for over almost 12% of the company's total revenue. 2017, we closed on our Mexico business $2.3 billion, just Mexico alone. So that's been significant growth for us, and it's of great relevance. On account of that, and to show our commitment to trade between or among both three countries, and talking specific about the Mexico-U.S. border, we've committed over $500 million just to increase and improve throughput through our borders by building new facilities and new yards. And also just recently we announced our highest single investment in one facility of over almost $600 million, which is to build a hump yard. A hump yard, for those of you that don't know what that is, it's like when you go to a sorting mail room. So every car goes to a different track, and those cars will go to different destinations. So we're going to build one of those in Texas. And the reason we're going to build that is not only to support the growth that we're seeing in the south part of the United States, mainly Texas and the Gulf, but also to support Mexico growth. And the reason of that is driven because of NAFTA. So definitely NAFTA has been a great promoter of growth for our company. We want to see NAFTA stay. We want to have a trilateral NAFTA. We don't want a bilateral NAFTA. We think keeping the three countries as a region makes most sense. When you think about the commodities that move by rail, we have pretty much every single commodity. You have raw materials coming south. You have finished goods coming north. So in railroad terms, when we hear someone talk about trade deficit, we kind of have a hard time with that because in our case, we see loads coming south and then loads coming back north. And it's pretty balanced from that perspective. You have grain that moves to Mexico. You have finished vehicles that come to the U.S. If you think about finished vehicles in the auto parts business, there's auto parts that come down to Mexico. That's auto parts that are produced in the States, create a lot of jobs, and they go to Mexico for a final assembly at a lower cost. If you think about vehicles, those vehicles not being competitive to be sold here in the U.S. on account of exiting NAFTA, those auto parts in the States may actually move to a different country. So you would actually lose jobs here in the States. So we're in favor of keeping NAFTA. Another aspect of that trade integration, you think about energy. Everyone has heard about Mexico's energy reform and how's that opening up a new market. So you have crude that comes from Canada and Mexico to U.S. refineries, and then that refined product will move to other markets. We're touching some of that on account of refined products moving down to Mexico. And if you look at the deficit that Mexico has, we don't see that trend reversing, not because the government is not doing anything about it, but it's just because demand has been increasing. I can go on and on with different examples, but from a rail perspective, we're very integrated. We see the volume growth. Again, I've talked about the investments we've done to support that growth, and in terms of the relationship with Mexican authorities and U.S. border authorities, there's been significant cooperation in finding ways to improve that trade. And a great example of that is that just recently we started a co-location center with Mexican Customs at the Laredo Gateway. So now the Mexican Customs is actually sharing images with Customs and Border Protection, so for processing cargo or freight across that gateway, and now we're exploring to do that same thing at Eagle Pass. So if you look at how the authorities are continuing to work in terms of that, maintaining that integration, we continue to see business as usual, and I think that's good. And that builds on the relevance of the relationship that the U.S. puts on Mexico trade and vice versa. So pretty encouraging.
Thank you. And Maria Luisa, from the perspective of UPS, how has NAFTA changed the industry? Or what is the size and the impact?
So, Paola, thank you so much for the opportunity and to the Wilson Center and the Border Trade Alliance to be here. I will be remiss if I don't say that I also belong to the Border Trade Alliance family. I say I was an alumni. Can I call myself an alumni from the Border Trade Alliance? NAFTA, in numbers, I wanted maybe to give you a little bit of perspective from a UPS. UPS moves on a daily basis in our network 3% of the world's GDP. And also we move on a daily basis, 6% of the country's GDP moves through our network. We are very much appreciate all the investments that Union Pacific is doing, because we also are one of the largest users of rail, the largest trucking company, and also the largest airline, one of the top three. I'm sorry for my FedEx friends that are here. And so for us, I'm giving that perspective because trade agreements do make a difference. And in our network, every time the United States or and especially the US signs a trade agreement, we see an increase in exports by 20%. And the majority of those are small and medium-sized enterprises. So definitely we have a big impact. We are part of different coalitions. Our CEO belongs to the Business Roundtable, and some of the numbers that we did there in coalition with a lot of the other companies that I thought one statistic to share with you is 122,000 U.S. small and medium-sized enterprises export to Canada and Mexico only. And so when we talk about small and medium-sized enterprises, that is a big impact. I think the other part that is important, 1/3 of all American merchandise exports go to Canada or Mexico. And so when you start looking at those numbers, that reflects the cargo that Bernardo was talking about. And so from a UPS, we see how the trade agreement NAFTA has really made the region more competitive. Every 22 packages that we move internationally support a job in UPS. And why does that matter? We're the third largest employer of the country. And so, of course, that has an impact on our jobs and as a company. But I think, Paola, it wouldn't be remiss of me to say that we do need to modernize the agreement. It's over 24 years old, and the economy that we saw, the environment when NAFTA was signed 24 years ago did not include e-commerce, did not include a consumer that is driven by phones, right? And is changing the speed and volume of how supply chain moves. And so we need to take that into consideration and how do we make those changes. But NAFTA has been great for our company. It has, I think, is one of the agreements that really open our company to become a global company. And definitely we support NAFTA and we want to have it modernized and improve.
Thank you. And then facilitating that, coordinating the goods movement, oftentimes there are customs brokers that do the logistics. Yes. And moving the goods. Can you tell me tell us from the customs brokers and the logistics industry how NAFTA has changed?
Sure.
Your industry.
Thank you, Paula. I'd like to thank the Mexico Institute, especially Chris Wilson for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here and sharing this panel with my friends Maria Luisa, Jose Martin, and Bernardo. Is always a good time to be here. So I'd like to first tell you who's CADEM. What do the customs brokers in Mexico do, and why are we here sharing this panel with you? CADEM is the National Confederation of Customs Brokers in Mexico, the equivalent to the US CBFAA here in the States, and the CSBC and CSCB in Canada. And almost 3 years ago, we understood that we had to even when governments were very well related and talking about, the international trade between both our countries, understanding that 80% of our exports come to the United States and 50% of the exports of the United States go to Mexico, we understood that us as customs brokers, we are the promoters of trade. All of the negotiations that are done by our governments, we are the ones that handle all the goods. In Mexico, 95% of the imports and exports that come out of Mexico or go into Mexico are handled through customs brokers. So we understood that we had to reach out for our colleagues here in the States and Canada. And in 2016, we signed an MOU with the customs brokers here in the States and Canada, because we clearly understood that we could not just watch our governments sit down and talk about international trade, but we had to do something more. And even if our governments, there was obviously going to be a change of administration here in the United States at that time, so we understood that we had to sit down and see what we could do as customs brokers and logistics businesses to help and promote the international trade between Mexico and the United States, obviously, and Canada. What the importance of NAFTA? It's very clear. The numbers are there, but let me go before NAFTA. Even when Mexico, before 1994, when Mexico was one of the closest economies in the world, we had a very important trade relationship with the United States. What NAFTA did in 1994 was bring certainty to that trade relationship. And what has happened between 1994 and now is that trade between our countries has grown 7 times. So nowadays, the international trade of product trades between the United States and Mexico is worth $1.5 billion per day are traded between the United States and Mexico. And that's important of the NAFTA. And the difference between what we see as a difference between other regions and what has made this North American region the most competitive in the world is that we have a shared production, very different to other regions. When you talk about an assembled car, a finished car that's sold here in the United States or Canada, we could think that car was built in Mexico and just brought to the United States and to be sold. But the truth is that car, to be built, crosses the border around 10 or 12 times. You know, parts going into Mexico, assembled in Mexico, back to the United States, they're assembled to another part of the car. So it goes back and forth, same as televisions, same as other electronics. So it's a very complex shared production that has made this North American region the most competitive. So I think that NAFTA in general, there's obviously things that could be worked out or modernized. That's the importance of thinking about NAFTA 2.0. But in general, NAFTA has brought a lot of good things to all our three countries. And as customs brokers, what we do not import or export products, but what we do is we make sure that products get to the United States and Canada in the fastest and most competitive ways, or products that are coming into Mexico also get into Mexico and comply with all the rules, pay all our taxes, and on behalf of the importers and exporters. And that's a reason we are here in these panels sharing our vision and what we see as we don't do politics. We don't sit down in the negotiating tables as our friend Jose Martin does. But once our governments agree, like they did in 1994 on a trade agreement like NAFTA, we are the ones that operate it for our clients. So that's the importance of us being here and sharing our vision with you.
Right. No, there's definitely an important role to be played by the private sector, right, by those that are intimately involved in trade, providing input, and then also, holding government accountable if policy is hurting or damaging the economy in either of the countries. Jose Martin, you can provide the Mexico perspective of how NAFTA has impacted the economy, certainly, but also perhaps how Mexico's economy has impacted the U.S. economy in our region, because we in San Diego, we're on the border. We say when San Diego catches a cold, Tijuana catches a cold, and vice versa. The same could be said about both countries, right? So the impact that Mexico has seen that's been beneficial can be felt. The U.S. benefits from that as well. Is that true?
Yes. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and share the panel with my colleagues. And thank you to the Wilson Center and to you, Paula. Well, yes, I could say because of that integration that Bernardo and Maria Luisa and Jose Antonio were talking about, it's because of that integration that our economies have become completely complementary to each other. So the impact of creating jobs in the U.S. has an impact of creating jobs in Mexico. Creating jobs in Mexico also creates jobs in the U.S. As our economies grow and interact more and more, we are actually expanding our output, and therefore we're also expanding our job creation at the same time. Mexico, I guess Mexican exports to the U.S. are beneficial to the U.S. Otherwise, they would buy it from somewhere else, no? Same as for Mexico. Because they have a better price, because they have the quality that the consumers want. And in other sense, our industries, they have not only integrated in the manufacturing or in the logistics, I guess our economies are also harmonizing many things, standards, and all, let's say, the requirements for a product. More and more, an American child that consumes certain, that plays with certain toys or consumes certain goods, or a Mexican child, they are actually playing with the same things, or you are consuming the same things or with the same standards, more and more. And same for the Canadian children. And the same happens for our clothing, or the same happens for every switch we turn on or off, in our houses. So these integration has produced harmonization with the highest standard possible. It's not that, let's say, the lower standard from one of the three countries applies. No, it's actually the higher standard that brings the other two standards to a higher level. Those benefits are also not told, and as the congressmen this morning, they made excellent presentations. But this is the part of the message that we have to send to everybody. It's not only the integration, which is, of course, everything derives from that, because that has made our industries more competitive, but it's also everything else, including our social relationship. The millions of children and young people in Mexico that are learning English, or the millions of young Americans that are learning Spanish at the same time. So that integration is benefiting the integration of North America in a way, and it's up to us to continue working on that, and expanding that integration, strengthening or deepening that integration.
And as part of that, as jobs in Mexico grow, that means we're growing our consumer market for the U.S. Those are more consumers that will be buying U.S. products.
And vice versa. I mean, someone has to transport that. There has to be a customs broker that processes that. There has to be a carrier that transports those goods. There has to be a small, medium, or large business that sells those in both countries. So expansion doesn't occur only on one side of the border. Expansion occurs everywhere.
And the reason I mention that is because part of the obstacles, the challenges, the negative messaging that we're hearing is centered around U.S. first or protectionist policies, where they don't necessarily work, right?
I guess
we benefit
it is
from
based on the wrong approach of seeing trade deficits as bad things. Trade deficits are not bad. Trade deficits are the result of private contracts, of private negotiations. Let's say that we are a country, the panelists, we are a country, and the audience is another country.
That's a
So-
good country to be a part of.
Well, we're a country, and we buy from the audience shoes, tomatoes, and computers in 1 year. And they buy from us televisions, cars, and socks, okay? So at the end of the year, in every transaction that I made with Ambassador Wayne or that Maria Luisa made with Chris, well, at the end of the day, at the end of the year, let's say that the panel country bought from the audience country $1 billion. And the audience country bought from the panel country $1.2 billion as a result of these private negotiations or private transactions. Where is the bad thing about that? The only thing is to say, where are these 200 billion difference coming from? They are coming either from lack of savings, no? They're coming from a fiscal deficit, they're coming from more debt, or they're coming from an expanded economy. Trade deficits sometimes are a good message. Trade deficits sometimes show that the economy is strong. The audience economy is growing, and they are capable of spending $200 million more than the panel economy. So the wrong approach of seeing trade deficits as bad things or trade surpluses as a good thing, I don't get it.
Or that trying to define one country's doing better than the other.
Yes, and any economist can tell you that trade deficits are not bad. Fiscal deficits are bad.
Yes, I have not
And they may
found
be
a
the
single
origin of
economist that agrees that trade deficit is the way to measure economic success.
Paula, yeah. As Jose Martin was saying, and so did the congressman before us in the morning. The thing is that a regular consumer doesn't understand international trade or value-added change or value change chains. They just go to the store, buy a sweater or a jacket or whatever. They look at the price and they say it's a good price, it's quality, and they just buy it. They do not know or understand that maybe that jacket was half built. The leather comes from one country. It was sold or built in another country, marketed or commercialized by another country, but they have it in their store at a better price. And the world is so global now that products move around the world so easily and so quickly that us consumers are looking always for better products at better price. But there's been a lack of information of what international trade means and why you can buy a car at that price. Because it's built, parts come from Asia, built in Mexico. The part of it is built in the United States. But then at the end, you have a car that's more competitive in price than the Asian cars or whatever. So people need to understand, and it's a job for all of us to let them know how these work. And I think that when NAFTA was signed in 1994, we all focused on making it work and make the region grow, but we never talked about the benefits of NAFTA. So now that we're in the process of this negotiation, tough negotiation, obviously, a lot of information is coming up that should have been in the table long before negotiations started, because people need to understand the benefits. Obviously, there's always challenges and opportunities. That's why we have the great Mexican negotiators in the table. So's the United States negotiators in Canada, because there's a lot of also opportunities, but there's been a lot of things that have been good in this trade relationship between the three countries.
Paula, if I may just add something about the trade deficit. I mean, last time I checked, Mexico has a larger trade deficit versus its GDP than the U.S. versus its GDP. And we're not complaining about trade deficit. Yes, we have a surplus now with the U.S., which sometimes is not the case. We currently have a surplus. But in the overall, we have a larger trade deficit, our trade balance, deficit, negative trade balance, with our whole international trade is, we have a deficit that is larger versus our GDP than the U.S. has versus
Right.
the GDP.
It does not define economic success.
No.
Trade deficit.
No. Sometimes it's a good symptom.
Correct, but it's very complex, and there's many factors that go into economic success and economic growth. And if we want, if there is a country that's going to benefit other than us, in addition to us, and grow economically, who better than our two closest countries, the ones that we share a border with?
And the U.S. consumers.
And the U.S. consumers, certainly. And for U.S. consumers, reports, economic reports show that the average American household of four saves annually $10,000 due to free trade. That's in lower cost of goods, lower cost of life, and the expansion, choice of goods. So we may not all have jobs that are related to trade, but we are all consumers. So we are all impacted by trade and NAFTA, certainly. But talking about jobs, we often talk about the manufacturing jobs. That's a very typical story that is told in terms of the jobs that are created and supported by NAFTA. We know that we have 14 million jobs that are supported by trade in the U.S., and we often think about just manufacturing jobs, but there's actually a whole diversity of jobs that are created, especially in the service sector, that the U.S. actually has a surplus of, in terms of the jobs that have been created. If we could talk, and I think you really highlight and represent many of those jobs that we don't often think about, aside from the manufacturing, the transportation of those manufactured goods, and then behind the scenes, accountants, legal advisors, marketing, that jobs that have been created to facilitate that trade. Can you each talk a little bit about the job growth? Maria Luisa, you mentioned that the jobs that have been created with UPS due to trade, the third largest employer, but specifically, what kinds of jobs? What do those look like?
So I mentioned, of course, that international trade for UPS is very important, and when we move 22 packages internationally, that supports a job in the UPS network. When we talk about jobs, we're talking about, of course, being an airline. We have pilots, we have airline, everything related to supporting the airline. We have, of course, our truck drivers. Usually here in the U.S., people think of the brown truck. Of course, that's that delivery. But then we have also our freight operations that move across North America. So that's another area that has that. And we also have brokerage services. So we have our customs brokers, our logistics specialists, because we work a lot with small and medium-sized businesses that, for example, want to. One of the things that we have to also mention maybe in here on the jobs is how automation and the internet has changed the world. And so when Toño was talking about the consumer and going and buying, we now have small businesses that go on the internet, and my grandmother in Ohio makes a beautiful necklace, and someone liked it and they want to sell it in Mexico, and they can just go to the internet and post the webpage. And of course, UPS, for example, we help them with the webpage. We help them how to package, how do they classify it, how do they use it so that Mexican customs can approve it. And so you have all those jobs that are created for specialists to help support that job. And when I mentioned the 122,000 small and medium-sized enterprises that move, that sell to Canada and Mexico, that is daily. I should have added that small factor. But that is because that is what the internet is doing. That also brings another complexity, which is these are new exporters that don't know anything about compliance. If you go and ask them about, do you know all the customs regulations? Because Jose and I are love customs, right, and customs regulations, but when you go to a small business, that's hard. So then you need the employment of Antonio. Toño loves more customs than
knows more.
Yeah, he knows more than the two of us together. But that also takes the training and the education, and so there's a lot of areas of complexity because we are becoming very integrated. So definitely there is that impact on jobs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I would just make some comments on that regard. I think that, and building a little bit on automation and efficiencies and productivity, I think, you know, speaking as a company, you're always trying to get a lot of efficiencies. And how you translate those into employment, if you look at Mexico, I mean, there's a rising middle class for sure. And part of that has been able to be accomplished on account, not only, of course, NAFTA and trade integration, but just because Mexico's economy has grown, it's more robust, it's more mature. So there's more employment there. Of course, some of that is associated to NAFTA. If you think about a lot of the U.S. companies down in Mexico, was sharing some comments with my friend Ruben a little while ago, and the members of the American Chamber of Commerce, they represent about 30% of total employment in Mexico. And that's a lot of U.S. investment down there. So it's significant in terms of how opening the market has allowed companies to invest and create jobs in Mexico. Now, you think about the U.S. In the U.S., when you hear the rhetoric around manufacturing and loss of jobs, manufacturing is up. What's happened is that there's more productivity, there's new processes, so there is a less need of certain jobs. But then, if you look at the employment market here in the U.S. right now, it's a very tight market. In our case, in Union Pacific, here in the States, we're trying to hire more what we call TNY, train, engine, and yard employees, and it's hard. It's hard to find them. We actually put out there hiring bonuses to attract people to work for the railroad just because there's a high demand for shipment of those goods, and some of those goods are going across the border. Over 40% of the traffic that we touch originates outside of the United States. Either originates or terminates outside of the United States. So clearly, not only transportation, but trade does impact transportation and consequently impacts jobs. Now, another comment along those lines, you think about exports of grain to Mexico. There's many, many jobs that are sustained on account of that trade and the demand that Mexico has for grain or grain products from the U.S. So net, I think that it's kind of an interesting accumulation of factors where you're seeing, yes, there's automation, yes, there are efficiencies, but there is a tight labor market right now in the U.S. where it's hard to hire, so there's employment is up. And then you have growth of employment in Mexico, and part of that is driven by more manufacturing, more demand of goods, and part of that's also driven by increased trade, not only in the region, but worldwide.
Can you mention international rail crews? How NAFTA has changed jobs and railroad jobs in particular in terms of working together?
So I think and you're opening a really interesting comment that, one of the things I knew that we went one time in the panel is how could you improve NAFTA? And I think that international crews, although it's something that certainly will create or build in those efficiencies across the border, and it's certainly going to create more jobs on both sides because we continue to see a rising trend in terms of products coming across the border, and we're very close to launching this pilot program at Laredo in conjunction with the KCSM, which also has to do with a co-location center that we were able to implement with SAT and working closely with CBP. But I also think that in terms of NAFTA, there has to be some reciprocity, and my friend Jose Martin knows about that because I've been talking about it for the last few years, where today there is a reservation in NAFTA where U.S. crews couldn't go into Mexico because rail employment is reserved for Mexican nationals. And now, Mexican nationals can come to the U.S. and run a train in the U.S. and in a restricted area because there's some other limitations, language barriers, and things of that sort. But I think there should be reciprocity. If you really want to accomplish those efficiencies and true integration, which is just beyond trade, there should be reciprocity where you can have a U.S. National run a train from a yard in Mexico and the U.S. to a yard in Mexico and vice versa, and then have a Mexican national do the same. And just build that pool of employees where they're just going across the border on a regular basis.
Yeah, and Bernardo is right. And it's a provision in the labor law in Mexico that hasn't changed, but there's a group working on that because we're going through a continued labor reform in Mexico. So yes.
And that's taking place outside of the NAFTA negotiations. But is the NAFTA negotiations an opportunity to?
I'm not familiar with the labor components of being discussed in NAFTA. I'm familiar with the customs and trade facilitation, but I don't know, but it's an effort. I mean, the issue derives from a provision in the Mexican labor law.
So talking about improving NAFTA and streamlining the customs processing, how can we benefit from an improved NAFTA, renegotiated?
So if I may, Paola, there's one thing that we have to, so let's talk about what was happening in Gotham City while NAFTA was taking place. No one likes Batman? Okay. You're all falling asleep, okay. I love Batman.
Follow Speedy Gonzalez.
Speedy Gonzalez. Ándale, ándale. So while NAFTA was happening, and it was signed 24 years ago, the supply chain started changing, the relationship between customs authorities changed, and automation happened, right? And technology really allowed us to have a conversation that we maybe worked for years on trying to, how do we improve the border efficiency? What do we do? And so all of a sudden with that environment, our customs authorities started talking and the WCO and WTO about single windows and facilitation and how do we look at border management, right? And so in the past 8 years, I will say we started all of this conversation of the connectivity between customs, the automation of the processes, of how can we, everything became related to how do you send and manage data. And that became very important, right? And so while all this was happening, Mexico launched their single window. The United States, 20 years later, launched it, 25 years, but we did it. And the automation began, the customs brokers have to do a change in their culture. I mean, it was a big change that we're still going through, right? And there's a lot of implementations, and the border communities had a big impact on infrastructure, on education. I mean, there was different impacts on that piece. While all of this was happening, NAFTA continued in 1994 terms, and so that's where the modernization, I think, has to reflect some of those changes. The cross-border management approach, and Jose Martin can agree or disagree with me, I don't think that is impacted by NAFTA itself because it's an agreement, it's a trade agreement. The cross-border management has been really the efforts of Jose Martin's leadership and in CBP's leadership of how do we work together, how do we manage data, how do we do better targeting, risk management, and this will result in more efficient movement of goods. That, I think, will continue to enhance because we as industry, we are very much pushing forward for it, and the authorities are working on it because we want to have a secure supply chain. The challenge with modernizing NAFTA is that NAFTA is a layer that speaks to the relationship, right? And it speaks to the competitiveness of the region. And so when we need to modernize the agreement to reflect the changes of the supply chain, that movement, what the investments that have been made, but also an agreement that reflects the importance of continuing to work together as a competitive region. And so when we talk about a trusted trader program, and I'm getting too weedy here into the weeds of showing my trade nerdiness. I don't know if that's the word.
I think we have a lot of trade nerds in the
I know,
room, right?
in the room.
It's okay.
But that is something that we have to be aware of and put aside from, as we're hearing the whole NAFTA. I'm an optimist like the ambassador to prior. I believe we will move forward, but we need to make certain that we reflect that cross-border management that we've been working so hard for, because we're seeing it. I can tell you, as a company that is a global company, that we have presence in 220 countries and territories, Asia is moving at the speed of light, and we have to remain competitive, and if we don't modernize and reflect that, then it will be a missed opportunity.
You know, and I want to talk about the role that security plays in the supply chain and the importance of secure trade. And the importance of cooperation, but can you tell us a little bit as well, from your view or from the customs view broadly speaking, how we can improve? What other specific things can we do to improve NAFTA?
Well, there's definitely two key components in modernizing NAFTA that will make it this region more competitive. One is streamlining procedures. That's we've been working on that for a long time, but also technology. There's a lot of information that we have that if we can share, we can make shipments more secure. They are more competitive in terms of how fast they move. So those are two key components that are covered under the umbrella of a trusted trader program. I think the trusted trader program, it's a good solution, but we need to have reciprocity in terms of mutual recognition. That's a word. In terms of mutual recognition, because if you take, for example, and I always use it as an example for that. Most of you, I guess, know what the global program is for passengers. I have my global card, and the difference between being in the global program and not being in the global program is that I register myself, I let the authorities know who I am, where do I live, where do I usually travel, and then they register my profile, so is my family's. And then every time I come to the United States, if I'm flying like I did yesterday from Mexico City to Washington, I just get into the kiosk of global kiosk, and they just make sure by my fingerprints that I'm who I am. I had a lot of trouble putting my fingerprints there, but finally they just recognize and make sure that I am who I'm saying I am, and I just go through customs without talking to anybody because they know who I am. They know I'm coming from Mexico. I usually come to Washington. But I'm pretty sure that if I flew from Mexico to Panama, then to Colombia, and then to Miami, I'm pretty sure they will stop me and just ask me, why did I change my regular schedule, and why was I? It's not that I did something wrong, but they're just going to be sure that they want to know what they did in those countries. So it's the same thing with cargo. We can do the same thing with cargo. If you register in a trusted trader program, and the Mexican government and the United States and the Canadian governments know who you are, what products you export, what markets you buy from, what are the regular channels, customs brokers, transportation companies you use, why do you stop them every time to check on them and make it more expensive for those companies to export or import if they're going to be moving the same product every time? Now, if they all of a sudden change, I don't know, a type of product, or they buy from another supplier or from a country that you consider a risk, or somehow you think it represents that risk, then you can stop that shipment and ask for information, just to be sure that that risk is not something that's going to turn into something bad for a country. But that's the ideal, and that's what we should be thinking. How can we make cargo move as fast as we're moving people right now in a program like a global program? And I guess the trusted trader programs are focused on that. But in order for them to work as they should, we have to have a mutual recognition, because if Mexico has its own program, United States has its own program, the CDPAD, and Canada has its own program, but they don't have mutual recognition. You still have to stop at the border and talk to some customs authority or whoever, because there's no mutual recognition of the program. So I guess that's a key to be able to move cargo faster between our countries.
And we can accomplish that. Did you want to add anything, Bernardo, about streamlining?
I always get stopped in Ciudad Juarez if I do what Antonio was referring to. If you change your pattern, I always get targeted in Juarez, and it's kind of a story, but it's I fly to Juarez and I walk across, and it's like, why we always fly through Dallas? Why go to Juarez? Anyway, but I think you're touching on something of real relevance.
You can move your mic.
Oh, sorry, of real relevance in terms of the statistics. When you talk about mutual recognition, we see it from a rail standpoint. When you're coming northbound, and we usually, let's say we're going to start a new business, that trade, that business will may get targeted by CBP once or twice, and then it's just business as usual, no problem at all. But if you're coming southbound, and Jose Martin, no offense to the Mexican government, you usually get targeted every time. That case is like for grain. I know it's not related to SAT, but on the Senacica-Zagarpa side, every grain train that comes down will have to go through a very rigorous process. And Mexico's, I think, the only country worldwide that has a zero tolerance for soil. And that's not a very efficient measure where almost every country has a tolerance for soil. So the U.S. has tolerance for soil, Canada has tolerance for soil, and Mexico does not. So you can definitely, have a same measure down in Mexico on that account. On the other hand, you have 1% of freight that usually comes to the U.S. Exports from Mexico to the U.S. gets targeted by CBP. And we have about 10% of the freight that goes to Mexico gets targeted by Mexican customs. So those are very clear examples of what Jose Antonio is talking about, mutual recognition, and that's something that clearly is an opportunity to improve on NAFTA.
Yeah, those are very good examples that we don't hear about or aren't aware of unless you're in that industry. But a lot of progress can be made. And Jose Martin, to the extent that you can share with us, during the negotiations, we do know that the chapter on trade facilitation and border management has primarily been completed or near completion, or a lot of progress has been made. To the extent that you can you share,
Sure.
from your perspective, some of these improvements
I'll
and what
be delighted.
we could see?
Bear with me because I have I brought just 19 topics here. But anyway, very quickly.
We have lunch. We
have
2 hours.
I know. I never thought, I participated in the negotiations of the current NAFTA 26 years ago. And I never thought in my wildest dream that I was going to negotiate a second NAFTA.
You could be negotiating again in 5 years.
We're not supportive of
Can you imagine?
do that right now.
Can you imagine? Yeah, but the same with other colleagues from different departments, from different ministries in Mexico. So the first principle has always been, let's improve it, let's do no harm, and let's modernize it. Under the Customs Administration and Trade Facilitation chapter, well, let me start by saying that in the current NAFTA, we don't have a chapter like this, what we're trying to do. So this is a good step forward. We do have, for example, in Chapter 5 of the current NAFTA, we have an article talking about customs cooperation and some things there, Article 512 and 513. But we don't have what we're trying to do under the current NAFTA. I just mentioned in general some of the topics that we are including in this new Customs and Administration and Trade Facilitation chapter. We're including, for example, the online publication of all our regulations, procedures, guides for anyone who wants to import and export that can do it easily. In Mexico, we have a single window. You can actually file with your electronic signature. You can file from your tablet. Yeah, your entry, whatever it's. Of course, with the assistance of a broker, it's much better. If you import glasses, glasses like this all the time, well, perhaps you can do it. But if you're going to import many things, you better consult an expert, no? But not only that, we are bringing to a treaty level this idea of publicizing in advance those regulations that are going to be implemented for comments. Now, it's something that we have in our legislation differently, so we're trying to bring this at a treaty level. We're trying to establish a mechanism for a constant, permanent dialogue with the trade community, so that we formalize these interaction with the trade community. We're trying to create inquiry points, or points where or centers where that can provide information to the general public and to traders. Advanced rulings, basically, we are the same level than the previous one, because advanced rulings, are advanced rulings. I guess the current NAFTA is at the right level, but we're also publicizing. With some edits, of course, to protect private information, the results of those rulings, so that we create transparency and uniformity in treatment to all traders in North America. We have some provisions on IT so bringing to a treaty level, something that we do, well, in Mexico since 1992, you file electronically But anyway, the idea is that from now on, everything at a treaty level, we have this provision on e-filing. No? Single window is there, as Maria Luisa was suggesting. Yes, the commitment of maintain the single windows, provide the service to the traders. On risk management, and this is key, and because we do a lot on risk management and targeting jointly. Let's say the U.S. and Mexico have an excellent cooperation. SAT and CBP have an excellent, strong cooperation on risk management and targeting. We have analysts at the National Targeting Center here. We're waiting for CBP also to deploy in our targeting center in Mexico. But just to give you an idea, and this is, I'm going to contradict what Duncan said at the beginning this morning, because he said, well, the SAT and CBP should cooperate in trying to interdict all these precursors, chemical precursors coming from Asia to Lázaro Cárdenas. Well, we do joint risk management and targeting out of just to give you a number, $2.7 billion in seizures of narcotics and chemical precursors have derived from this cooperation of joint risk management and targeting, not only at Lázaro Cárdenas, at all seaports and everywhere. But risk management helps us segregate cargo, let's say, the one that we suspect that may be a threat from the rest. And of course, the rest is about 99%. Of shipments, something in line with what Antonio was saying. We do have a mutual recognition on our AEO, our Authorized Economic Operator Programs, and CTPAT. We do have that. The problem is what Antonio was saying, that we have to bring it down to earth, okay, and make this mutual recognition something real in life, not only just harmonization or benefits, bring it down to earth. We also have, as in the current NAFTA review and appeal processes, we're trying to create a new concept of administrative guidance for traders that can consult with the port, and the port can immediately consult with the different, something similar to advanced rulings, but something, let's say, more expeditious for certain situations. We have provisions on how to apply penalties, how to provide opportunities, similar opportunities to traders when a penalty is applied. We introduced Mexico. Many of these things were introduced also by Mexico, but for example, new ones that were introduced by Mexico. For example, a new provision or provisions on standards of conduct of the customs personnel, so that traders have the opportunity to initiate investigations on customs personnel, for example, or investigate something if something is wrong. No, we're proposing the creation of a trade facilitation committee that we don't have. We have something in 513 today in NAFTA, but this is bigger, and that this trade facilitation committee, the idea is that we have the participation from time to time of the private sector. We need the input of the private sector, depending on the topic, depending on the sector.
Would that be similar to COAC, but on a trilateral?
But trilateral, yeah, but let's say that the committee is between the authorities, but also that request input from the trade, okay?
Jose Martin, would that be related to the TFA requirement of a national or
It's consistent with. Consistent with, but I guess.
Oh,
The
yes.
trade
with
facilitation
the trade
agreement.
facilitation agreement, I
Bali.
apologize. With the trade facilitation agreement,
Known as the Bali.
not as a
And then
Bali.
COAC, which you actually participate.
And it's also in TPP,
Can you explain?
but the U.S. is not in TPP, so.
So maybe just a little bit to complement on that, because this is awesome, and when Toño was saying it's good to have Jose Martin leading the Mexico negotiations, you can tell why on his passion. The private sector input, very important. The trade facilitation agreement passed, and one of the requirements of the countries have to implement was to create a national, they call it National Private Sector Facilitative Group, comprised with industry and government, so that they can have, because that came as a result of best practices that they saw of the COACs of the world, of others, where you can come up with joint input with industry and government on how to develop trade policies. And so
Yes.
that's very nice.
The
very
idea
good
is
to
that this
hear
committee gets input from the trade community, And but it's between the customs administrations of the three countries, but we get input from the trade community, and I'm sure that from time to time we'll bring them to the table to discuss issues, no? But that's
time to time.
precisely, yeah, no, but because we will have our government-to-government meetings, but also we will invite, of course, the private sector. Let me get now to specific customs initiatives, because we're trying to bring to the agreement, and to bring it to an agreement or treaty level. It's something that we do today. It's something like unified cargo processing, shared customs facilities, harmonization of cargo manifests.
Joint inspections.
Yeah, joint inspections. All those things we are trying to bring to the agreement, to the level of the agreement. One that is a huge demand from both sides of the border is how can we work, we call it the border inspection initiative, but the idea is how do we bring all the competent authorities that have something to do with the inspection of a good entering one country or the other to one single place. Let me give you an example. Trucks coming from Mexico to the U.S., after they pass through CBP, they have to go to the DOT facility for examination or inspection of the truck. And then, let's say if they're in Texas, they go to Texas DOT for another examination. There's a redundancy of inspections there. Why don't we do the whole enchilada in one single place? That's the idea. So the border inspection proposal is something that we are exploring. How can we bring everything to one all the competent? Same for southbound shipments. I mean, we are making efforts, and on our side, we have already brought, let's say, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Mexican EPA, for the examination of the wood pallets, for example. But we want to bring Zagarpas and Asica, everybody, to the same location so that we can clear, inspect, release a shipment at the same location. We're introducing provisions on confidentiality and protection of information of the traders, consistent with our laws, consistent with the agreements that we have. Fortunately, we have an agreement with the U.S. since 1976 that we modernized in 2000, and we have never had a breach. Hopefully, we will continue with that. So, but the idea is that also at the treaty level, we're trying to protect the information of the traders. Equally important is that Mexico introduced a complete proposal on customs enforcement. The trade community demands that the benefits of the treaty are granted only to those that legitimately can claim the benefits of the agreement. We have a lot of abuse from let's say, falsification of origin, illegal transshipment, undervaluation, and other things. So the trade community is demanding this. So we introduce a strong proposal on customs and trade enforcement, and we are also proposing the creation of a customs enforcement committee, same as the customs facilitation committee or trade facilitation committee. So those are some aspects of the things that we have introduced. Responding to your first question, we're making a lot of progress. We have made a lot of progress in all these things. So fortunately, if the negotiations continue and we progress, we can finish this. And yes, the customs and trade facilitation components of the new NAFTA will be a complete modernization of the agreement in comparison to what we did in 1994.
A great opportunity, I think, for all three countries. Anybody want to add to the wish list? Do you have a birthday coming up? Something you want to add to the agreement? Or question, go ahead. Your name?
Russ Jones, member of the board of BTA, past chairman. My colleague up there, Customs House Brokers. This panel and several of the others, particularly the one with Congressman Correa and Hurd, kind of danced around and alluded to how we define, what metric defines the relationship, the trilateral relationship. Nowhere in the world is there three countries that share nearly 5,000 miles of contiguous borders. You take Mexico and Canada, put them together, and it doesn't represent quite half of the United States population or economy, and their economy. The current simplistic method that we're using to define is an easy method, and that's the one that seems to get the most traction. But should we take the opportunity within the context of NAFTA to create a new metric or an algorithm that takes in consideration currency, direct foreign investment, services, retail, and other areas that we have become integrated in our economies, that the current one, the simple trade deficit issue, which we keep bogged down here, would it not be a great opportunity to come to consensus on how we define the benefit, and one that is meaningful and measurable?
So, I mean, maybe just to build on your comment, I would agree with that. From a foreign direct investment perspective, if you look at the investments that have taken place in Mexico are significant and vice versa. To your point, Congressman Hurd, he mentioned that. You think about like Rosini, everyone thinks that that's a company that is based in the U.S. and almost every vehicle in the world has a Rosini component, and it's a Mexican entity with significant investments in the U.S. The same is true for Constellation. I mean, not only they're a customer, but you think about Constellation, the brewery at Nava, at Rio Escondido and Piedras Negras. I would think that the beer, the only thing that it's Mexican, it's the water and the processing, because the glass bottles, the raw materials for this production, they're coming from the U.S. and then the people in the U.S. are consuming it. I mean, we're shipping over 200 carloads per day of beer. I mean, it's a lot of beer being consumed, and it's great to keep it at a lower cost. So I think that, to your point, I think you're absolutely right. I think there is an opportunity for that. I don't know if that's a metric to be built around NAFTA, but certainly it's something that I think as we talk about trade through the BTA, through our organizations of which we're members, like GATEM, AmCham, CCE, the Chamber of Commerce, I certainly think that continuing to emphasize the relevance of trade from another angle, it should go a long way.
I would add to that the harmonization of standards and other things that we mentioned during the conversation. All those things are valuable, are the effect of an integration. And yes, we're using already some metrics like the 40% component in every Mexican good, in average, in every Mexican good that comes to the U.S. It has a U.S. 40% component. So those, but we have to expand on that. What I mentioned about the job, the exponential creation of jobs, because if a job is created in Mexico that is connected to the U.S., it's also creating jobs in the U.S. and vice versa. Yes, we have a long way to go in building these algorithms or formulas that will support the great story, the great NAFTA story.
But wouldn't it help you also get beyond this issue of the rules of origin much better if you had a better metric that better defined the relationship?
Yeah, also.
But it's complex, Rosa. It's complex, and we're in a room of people that speak trade and understand trade. When you get out of a room of people that don't speak trade, is making the story, right, on how do you connect it to your job, to your quality of life. And even though there's a lot of, we're all trying to send out that message, I think it's a good question for us as a trade support community. How do we better communicate and relate to, in another way, to that message? Because the numbers are not clicking.
It's very complex, and I think if our target audience is the people, it's everyone, in terms of consumers especially, how do we easily convey that? And I think Congressman Hurd mentioned that earlier, how he explained it to his brother, which can really drive the point home. We have a couple more questions. I see a couple hands. We'll go to Eric and then over there.
Hi, thanks, Paola. Eric Lee, North American Research Partnership. Jose Martin Garcia, have a question. Thanks for your update on the trade facilitation discussions. Very interesting to hear how UCP is being integrated into those discussions. Would you mind backing up just a few steps and just talk briefly about the development of UCP and its kind of current and future rollout, some lessons learned, maybe?
Well, yeah, we started years ago with what we call cargo pre-inspection, so that we could pre-inspect cargo at the exporting country, at the facilities of the exporting country. We then began expanding the program with a different approach to do these joint inspections at the facilities of the importing country. And at that time, we called it UCP. We had two different memorandums of understanding for each of them. We decided to merge the program into one single framework, let's say legal framework, and we did that. The agreement was signed about 2 months ago in Mexico. So we have merged both programs into one single program that we call UCP. The program is operating at 10 locations at the U.S. Mexico border, on both sides of the border, different locations. And we have programs of a variety of programs in different approaches. Let's say we have for different modes of transportation. We have in rail, we have in truck, we have in air, in airports. So for air cargo, for rail, for trucks, we have programs where ports where we process all the shipments through UCP. We have ports where we only process AEO CTPAT participants. We have ports where we only process shipments from certain specific industry sectors. So I would say that we are still going through this learning process that we started 3 years ago, or 4 years ago. Of course, with much more experience. And we have reached the point where we are developing criteria for the expansion of the program, and hopefully we can do that. So our next steps would depend also on the successes of these current programs and pilots, and how do we expand it at these locations, and then in the future locations according to a criteria. I understand that also Canada is discussing this with CBP, so Canada may also join for certain facilities this program, or they will have their own with the U.S., but also we can do it trilateral certain locations. So it's a program that we created this program a few years ago. We're still learning very quickly, and we hope that it will continue to be expanded.
Perfect, thank you. And our last question right here, if you can make it brief, please.
Yes, this is for Mr. Vidales. I want to ask if it would be practical from your perspective if there were to be a rule of origin that contained an aspect on the wage of the people who made the auto part, like how that could actually be implemented. Do you think it is practical?
The truth is, I wouldn't, from our customs broker's perspective, or as a Mexican citizen, I think it's hard for it to be included in the ruling of origin, and that's one of the discussions that have been going on and maybe one part of the reason that they have not reached an agreement. I think it's hard to include labor on that part, but I wouldn't be the you would have to go to the automotive industry to ask them if it would be a good idea, because us as customs brokers, whatever, I'm very optimistic in a sense that we're going to reach an agreement. Obviously, I cannot define a timeline, but I'm pretty sure that we're going to reach an agreement, and whatever agreement our governments reach, we as customs brokers implement it in the day-to-day operation. So I wouldn't be the correct person to ask for that. That would be the auto industry, and whatever the agreement they reach on the time they do, we're going to have to implement it and work on that. So
we're getting to the end of our panel discussion here. So I'm going to do just a quick rapid fire round of questions where just answer yes or no, if you can.
No.
And it
No.
depends.
No, and no.
Yes, no, and it depends.
I guess you could say no comment, but So there are points of contention. We are discussing some parts of the renegotiations, and some of the provisions and proposals that may not be acceptable would are reaching, and we all want to be very optimistic about reaching an agreement, but could we reach an agreement that would not be acceptable to the private sector or to any of your industries, either your business, your industry, if you want to speak on their behalf? Sunset clause, anybody support or oppose? Sunset clause, do you support?
We don't think it's a good idea.
No. Rules of origin requirements. I mean,
It depends on the industry. I wouldn't be able to talk about
the seasonality of agricultural products is another one, and arbitration. Anyone else want to comment if there's?
So those were really quick, but I can make a few comments, just brief. I think that everything can get improved. I think a NAFTA 2.0 version makes sense. I think that the regional content, Mexico has ceded in some of the asks. I think if the regional content goes up, in a way that improves the competitiveness, at least for the region in itself. There will be challenges to implement, but it's hard to say if it's going to work or not. I think on the sunset clause, we're not supportive of a sunset clause as it's talked about today, but it makes sense to revisit the agreement every 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, whatever. You can't allow any document, even for us that are in the private sector. You have contracts that get renewed on a 3-year, 5, 10-year basis, and you're revising those documents regularly. So it does make sense to have some type of formality to go back and revisit the things that need
I think
to be
perhaps just the uncertainty that would create in the private sector. But just real quick,
So no, I agree. We do not support, as part of the bigger coalition that we're part. We do not support the sunset clause. We do agree that we need to have further review. But that's also adding to consideration that the supply chain is changing so fast on how it moves that we need to have that forward-thinking process.
and perhaps having that committee or a couple of the committees that are being proposed during the renegotiations can help provide that input and that feedback throughout the period, where it's not even in 5 years, but throughout the period. And from Mexico's perspective, support for the sunset clause?
Well, not to sunset clause, not to seasonal, not to the others.
Arbitration, government procurement.
The way they've been presented,
No.
I don't think they're actually counterproductive in terms of investment, in terms of many things. But I guess you raised a very important point when you said, well, if we were going to negotiate an agreement or accept an agreement that would not be good for industry, or something like that. I'm sorry. Well, no. I would say never. Why are we going to do that? We're a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Why are we going to negotiate something that goes against our industry?
Yeah. And to that, the President of the United States, June 5th, held a press conference or made some comments to the press reiterating his desire to negotiate individually with Canada and Mexico. Would you support a bilateral agreement instead of NAFTA? Yes, no?
No.
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 The Mexican government has made it very clear. The Secretary of Economy has made it very clear. This is a agreement of three. In this case, you need three to tango. The Canadian Prime Minister have said the same thing. I guess Mexico's and Canada's position is no. It's because everything we said today about this integration. That's why, because that's why we believe we shouldn't follow that path.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Obviously, we started the conversation talking about the benefits, but also the risks. And I think the risks are great. As we talked about the diversity of jobs that have been created, the consumers that benefit, which is everyone, unless you don't consume anything. Not only how our exports have grown from the U.S., but also the benefit that we gain from the imports. And then, which is not often talked about, the cooperation and collaboration which has been fostered through NAFTA. It was mentioned earlier, trade existed before NAFTA, and it will exist after. NAFTA was the confirmation of this trilateral cooperation, which has then resulted in much, in much more. So there is a lot to, risks is high. Our competition as a unit of 3 is greater. And I don't believe that we would have been awarded the World Cup for 2026 if we had submitted that individually. And so that's a perfect example of how when we come together as 3, we can win and we can beat out other countries. It is the North American advantage that we have that we don't want to lose. So please join me in thanking our panelists, Jose Antonio, Bernardo, Maria Luisa, Jose Martin. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
The NAFTA World.
Thank you so much to the panel. We're now going to move across the way. You can grab lunch. There'll be people outside sort of directing you through, but we're going to go into the dining room for the next session, which is a keynote with Commissioner Macalinen.
Muy bien.
Muy bien, mi querido.
Igual.
Gracias.
Bien, bueno, mi hija y su esposo vienen a